So Keynes said that there's no surer way of overthrowing the capitalist order. Now I have to add my own commentary to this. The capitalist order means civilization, which it's just people free to produce and free to trade. And to the extent that you stamp that out is the extent that you have brutality and tyranny and the extent to which civilization collapses. And if you get as far as North Korea, they're starving to death.
This week's special with Miles Franklin Precious Metal Investments. Kilo Valcambi silver bars for only $2.75 over spot. 10-ounce Nadir's silver bars for only $2.95 over spot. Call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance. We have a first-time guest today. Keith Weiner joins us. He is the founder and CEO of Monetary Metals. He's not only an advocate for sound money from a very unique perspective, but also an advocate for educating people on how they can earn yield on their physical precious metals such as gold. Keith, thanks for joining us this first time on Liberty and Finance.
Thanks for having me.
We've been intrigued by any way that we can help people understand the reality and the risks surrounding our current fiat currency system and how they can protect their families' financial futures. You've got a unique take on that, and we'd like to hear from you because one of your missions, it appears for me, is scanning the video blogs that you've produced over the years, is on educating people about some of the realities that are borne out by history and by things that they haven't been told about the risks of our fiat currency. In fact, you have talks such as the dollar cancer, and you've talked about the role that gold can play at bringing truth to and sound money, but from a unique perspective. So we'd like to hear your perspective on that, as well as your specific proposition that you've been practicing for the past several years of providing opportunities for people to earn a yield in gold on their gold. So if we could first talk about your education that you've done with people about the risks of fiat currency and specifically the dollar as a cancer, and tell us why you say that, and help us all to understand that in a way that from the way that you see it.
So thank you for that intro. I think the place to start with all of this is, you see, what people haven't been told. People from their very earliest days are taught that money means pieces of paper with green ink printed on it. So if you go to Google Images and you do a search and type in money, you'll see page after page after page with individual dollar bills and cartoon characters holding up wads of them and pallets of them and printing presses where they're rolling off. That is what people think money means. But if we rewind back in history, let's say to the founding of America, it was pretty well understood that money meant specie, gold and silver. And when you deposited money in the bank and got a piece of paper, the piece of paper was a receipt that said you're entitled to be repaid the money. Kind of like, in a fancy restaurant, you leave your coat at the coat check clerk and you get a little ticket. Nobody really confuses the ticket with the coat. But because of the various, I use the word adulterations, to our monetary system in the last almost 50 years, people have come to confuse the coat check claim with the coat itself when it comes to the money. And, even esteemed members of the Austrian school will say, well, money just means the commonly accepted medium of exchange. So, okay, let's suppose we go with that. Let's just rewind back to the gold standard. Let's call it 1870, 150 years ago. Suppose you walked into a bank with a piece of paper that said $20 on it, and you pushed that across the window to the teller. The teller understood what that transaction meant and would push a gold coin back to you. So I gave a talk. This was at an academic conference at a university, and I said, you don't owe me an answer, but you owe yourself an answer to this question with all due discipline in your answer. Don't just wave your hand. I said, if the word for the piece of paper that you give to that teller to redeem for the gold, if the word for the paper is money, then what is the word for the gold coin for which that paper redeems? Silence in the room. And these people absolutely believed that the dollar is money, bad money, inflationary money. The Fed is doing all kinds of horrible things. I absolutely would agree with all those premises, but they defend it as money. And I said, well, if that's money, then what's the word for the gold? Another money? Anyway, it becomes confusing. And so you have to kind of untangle all of these concepts. And so when you do that, you realize that we don't have money in the monetary system. It's been banished by degrees. FDR in 1933, making gold illegal to possess for U.S. citizens, voiding all the gold clauses and contracts. So before 1933, a bond was payable in gold. I gave a talk at the Harvard Club in New York, and upstairs they have on the walls all kinds of interesting memorabilia from over the last century or so. And they had an old railroad bond from 1902 or 1906, I don't remember now. And I took a picture of it, and the cameras on these phones nowadays are so high res, you can just zoom in and zoom in and zoom in. So I didn't read it on the wall, I just took the picture, but in zooming in, you could read all the fine print and see, the term was like 90 something years. The bond matured in 1998. So people were very trusting in those days, very long duration credit. But anyways, it calls right on it for repayment in the standard gold legal tender coin of the day. So repayment of a bond meant repayment in gold. FDR, 1933 ends that. 1971, Nixon severs the last link to gold, whatsoever. The system becomes pure irredeemable. 1975, Congress says, well, gold doesn't matter anymore. Let it trade like frozen orange juice and pork bellies. Let it trade as a commodity, and that's what they did. And all of this history was kind of forgotten to the point we get today, where the regime of the dollar has two fundamental problems. And I'm not going to say rising consumer prices, although that can be a problem, and I'm not apologizing for it in any way. But the two fundamental problems are the interest rate is totally unhinged. The interest rate could shoot to the moon, as it did from 1947 and 1981, and the interest rate can collapse into the black hole zero. And as we've seen in Switzerland, Germany, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, UK, Japan, it's this disease that's spreading around the world. The interest rate actually would go below zero. So imagine depositing $1,000 in a bank and after 10 years having $900. Like, it's that stupid, it's that retarded. The second problem is that there is no extinguisher of debt. We pay debts using dollars, but dollars are themselves IOUs. So when you pay a debt using an IOU, you simply shift it around. So imagine you have a lump of dirt under the rug, you're just shifting it from one place to the other. And meanwhile, it's growing because every year you have to add the accrued interest to the debt. So the debt is growing exponentially. As we'd say in my previous career as a software programmer, that's not a bug, that's a feature. That's designed into the nature of the very system. And it's tempting to think if we had the right politicians, if Ron Paul were elected president and we had, a Senate full of Mike Lees and Justin Ameshers and so forth, that we would get this under control. But actually, it isn't even mechanically possible. It has to grow exponentially. And so an exponential growth in debt, I call it a cancer. So, imagine like you have a thyroid in your neck. It is a necessary organ for life. But if that becomes cancerous, it begins to grow out of control. And then that necessary organ mutates into something that is now consuming you. And if you allow it to grow unchecked, it will kill you. Debt is a necessary thing in an economy. We have to finance productive enterprise. But debt that has no cellular mechanism for cell death and so forth, which is one of the problems of cancer, grows out of control and eventually consumes us. So that's what I call the dollar cancer.
You also mentioned when we were talking that your perspective on this is going to be maybe different from what many sound money advocates hold. How do you see your view being different?
I like to talk about this quote from John Maynard Keynes. And so I think everybody kind of understands and agrees he's definitely one of the villains when it comes to economics and certainly monetary economics.
Just another quote before you launch into that. I believe it was attributed to Richard Nixon at the time, saying, "We're all Keynesians now." So if he's agreed to be a villain, and yet we have a president of the United States who's the same one who severed the dollar from the gold standard, saying that we're all Keynesians. Who do you think Nixon was referring to as "we are all"?
Well, himself and his own policies. Anyways, I regard Richard Nixon as also one of the villains. So the fact that he sided with Keynes doesn't at all surprise me. Ironically, at the time that Nixon was facing this crisis, where certain other countries, particularly France, pugnaciously so, redeeming their dollar bills and in exchange for the gold, which was still possible at that time for foreign central banks, not for U.S. citizens. They could walk up with $35 in paper cash and walk away with an ounce of gold up until 1971. And that was a growing crisis. The rate at which they were redeeming dollars was growing and growing. And you could plot out and say, when would the U.S. be drained of all of its gold reserves? So this was a crisis. The leading Keynesian at the time, Paul Samuelson, believed that Nixon was going to devalue and then just say, well, gold isn't $35 an ounce. Now it's whatever, $100. I don't know what he thought the price should be. And had actually written an article for the Washington Post, I think it was all set, ready to go. It was actually Milton Friedman, Free Markets Friedman, whispering in Nixon's, Keynes, in Nixon's ear, saying, just declare the dollar to be redeemable and be done with it. And so that's what Nixon did. And I guess Nixon had the honesty to say it's a Keynesian sort of move. And then, of course, and by the way, everybody, if you haven't seen it, go on YouTube. The video of Nixon's little speech on TV is preserved on YouTube, where he says, well, if you're buying American goods made in America and not buying, stuff made abroad, this will strengthen the purchasing power of your dollar, this temporary move, blah, 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 blah. And he's just so mendacious. And of course, hailing or ushering in the age of quite an incredible inflation that occurred on the heels of that. What a lying villain he was. So anyway, so Keynes said that there's no surer way of overthrowing the capitalist order. Now I have to add my own commentary to this. The capitalist order means civilization, which it's just people free to produce and free to trade. And to the extent that you stamp that out is the extent that you have brutality and tyranny and the extent to which civilization collapses. And if you get as far as North Korea, they're starving to death. And North Korea would be even worse than it is if goods weren't coming in from outside North Korea, if the world were entirely under that kind of fist. People would just starve to death, and that would be the end of it. So there's no surer way to overthrow the capitalist order. Keynes, by the way, was socialist. And he approvingly cites Lenin and other places. He actually wanted to overthrow the capitalist order. There's no surer way to overthrow the capitalist order than by debauching the money. And he goes on and on and on with this quote, which many of the gold people will be familiar with. And at the end, he says, by engaging the hidden forces of economics, which today we would say incentives, in favor of destruction, and not one in a million could diagnose, what is happening and how their capitalist order is being overthrown. Now, I think this is where I might part ways a little bit with a lot of the folks in the honest money movement. I think people tend to assume that what he meant, because he said debauching money, that what he meant was, creating inflation. Now, I'm just old enough to remember the late 70s, and I'm going to guess that you probably do as well. Everybody was talking about inflation every day. 5 days a week on the nightly news, they talked about the so-called misery index. And that stands out in my mind today. I was 12 years old in 1979. The misery index, which is unemployment plus inflation. Inflation was running at whatever it was, claimed on the TV at that time of 15 or 20%. Looking up the statistics now, it's reported at 13% or something. It was probably higher. I remember going to the grocery store with my parents. It's a 12-year-old kid. It's not like I was thinking about money per se. I noticed the price of every good in the supermarket was up noticeably every week. Everybody was talking about it.
I will add my own little anecdote to that, and I'm sure our viewers would, in the comments below, guys, you can go ahead and add your most vivid memories of the rampant inflation eras of the late 70s. Mine was working while in high school as a drafter at a mechanical engineering company where we did energy audits, and these energy audits were officially, again, they kind of spawned out of the oil crisis, which also was another symptom of this runaway inflation in many different ways. But they to counsel companies on how they could cut their energy bills by investing in insulation and all kinds of other things. But all of the calculations were infinitely more complex because we had to project forward the cost of money into the future because of inflation. So we had to inflation adjust every if they put in the money now this year into insulation, how much are they going to save the next 5 or 10 years in heating and cooling and all that sort of thing. And everything was about net present value of the money, not just because of the cost of borrowing, as it would be in any business or financial enterprise. It was about because you couldn't calculate a payback accurately unless you did all these adjustments year by year by year and quarter by quarter for inflation.
Yeah, imagine if you're a civil engineer trying to design and construct a skyscraper. Imagine if the meter shrunk with every floor that you went up, so that on the 80th floor, a meter is this long.
Well, that's what Disney does. It's called forced perspective. It makes small buildings look bigger. Yeah, go ahead.
But imagine you're actually trying to build a real building.
Understood.
And so you have to talk about height-adjusted or floor-adjusted meters. I don't think anybody would be able to build anything taller than 1 story. It would just be impossible. And in economics, we're supposed to just deal with this and say, well, that was $1979. You see, in 2015 dollars, that it's all different. And none of those adjustments really work. They're just at best zeroth order approximations of complex curves and that are nonlinear partial differential equations or whatever that might be. So, anyways, I don't think that, so to think that what Keynes meant with inflation is either just simply projecting what today, so this would be somewhat anachronistic, what today we're obsessed with, projecting that back onto Keynes, contemporaneous ideas anachronistically on Keynes, or it would be to assume that Keynes was pretty stupid and that Keynes thought that nobody would notice that prices were skyrocketing. I don't think Keynes was stupid. There's nothing about that person that I think was good in any way, but I will accord him that I think he was a genius. I think he was an evil genius who turned his genius towards destruction. He was a mastermind trying to destroy our world, but I think he was smart. I don't think that he, for a minute, was so dumb as to think that nobody would notice inflation running 15% per year. And in my direct experience and in your experience, everybody noticed it. Everybody talked about it every day in 1979. So that's not what he meant at all. Separately, he talks about driving the interest rate to zero, to euthanize the rentier, whom he called a functionless parasite. He argues that the return on capital should be a zero, or maybe he grudgingly concedes just above zero because the managers of capital have to get paid, for their labor in managing the capital. But he's obsessed with this idea of driving the interest rates to zero. Now, that is a hugely destructive force that people are not really, everyone knows the interest rate's going to zero, but I don't think people are understanding how that's destroying our world. And I think that's what he meant. By driving interest rates to zero, we're going to destroy, but we're going to do it in a way that people aren't going to be focused on. And the reason is the asset price, when you mentioned net present value, what's the net present value of a perpetual asset as the interest rate is cut in half? It doubles. So this is a process of doubling NPV of every asset, which means doubling real estate prices and stock prices. Nobody perceives how this is destroying the world because it's a bull market. And everybody in the liberty movement surely has had the frustrating experience of arguing with somebody. So when a Republican's in office, we're arguing with Republicans. When a Democrat's in office, we're arguing with Democrats. And the person who's defending their guy in office is saying the economy is wonderful. And what's their proof? Stocks are going up. And you're sort of left to reckon with this. Well, how could stocks be going up? Stocks are businesses. Businesses are doing well. Maybe the economy is doing good. The argument is kind of hard to debunk until you realize that the reason why stocks are going up is the discount rate is going down because the interest rate is going down, which is a function of the fiat currency and the Federal Reserve and its machinations and manipulations and distortions and financial repression and so on. That's how we're destroying the world. is by destroying the price signal, which is the interest rate.
Given that view of Keynes's, let's, instead of calling it smart, maybe we'll say shrewd or conniving approach to destroy Western civilization through debauching the currency, as he called it. You mentioned, as we were getting ready to do this interview, that it was more than monetary inflation that he was talking about. It was about control as well. Can you explain to us about that?
Yeah, so that's ultimately what the central planner is grasping at, right? I mean, there's two fundamental views as to how human beings are going to go produce and trade. One is let them be, laissez-nous-faire, let us alone. So that if I want to produce something and you want to buy it and you produce something else that I want, let us trade and set a price and so forth. And the other is central planning. It's that everybody has to be forced at gunpoint to produce what they're told to produce under the circumstances they're told to produce it and to trade it with who they're supposed to trade it with at the price that's set and so on. And they want to control it. And so what better thing to get control of than the price of money, which is the interest rate. And that's where I think, Keynes was coming from. And of course, what was the purpose of that control was to get capitalism to destroy itself. Lenin infamously smirking that we'll sell the capitalists the rope with which, or the capitalists will sell us the rope with which we hang them. They're just obsessed with this idea of we'll control them to their own doom, which we direct, and we want that doom to happen. And I think that's should not be underestimated.
So you've spoken widely about this reality and about this danger that people largely don't understand, and you've been trying to get the word out, trying to get people to understand this. What are you trying to accomplish through that? What are you hoping that the outcome will be for people if they wake up to this fact?
So I think that there's a prevailing view, and certainly libertarians fall to this as much as anybody else, which is that government has an intrinsic tendency to just grow and become more tyrannical. And I think it's not intrinsic to government. I think it's because we, the people, with each generation, just demand the government do more and more. We think it's for us, but actually it's doing it to us. It's the old, they break our leg and then isn't it great, they're giving us free crutches. But there have been instances where there is something that is absolutely unjust and tyrannical that has been repealed. And so I think it was the Cato Institute that put out a book called Bootleggers and Baptists, or Baptists and Bootleggers. And it's this idea that when you have this unjust regime, usually there's this unholy alliance between the moralizers who justify it and give it, some, if not academic, at least intellectual cover, and the bootleggers that are profiteering from it. And they're talking about alcohol prohibition and how literally the Baptists were against alcohol and wanted it to be illegal. But there's a whole bootlegger industry of everybody from the distillers to the drivers that were transporting it to the people who ran the speakeasies, the organized crime syndicates that were being involved in distribution and so on. There was quite a large constituency of people that rather enjoyed that it was illegal.
You didn't mention the crooked authorities that were on the take from the organized crime as well.
Oh yes, of course, the police chiefs that were making huge, much more than their salaries, I'm sure, in bribes and whatever. So you had quite a big constituency that supported it on the bootlegger side, and probably equally large, if not larger, constituency on the moralizing side. And so you might say, and then Cato argues that these things become very entrenched and very hard to overturn. But it was overturned, and I think these things become overturned. Jim Crow is another one. It looks like marijuana now, and asset forfeiture is another one that's sweeping the states right now. That these things do get overturned, but they only get overturned when a sufficient number of people become, to paraphrase one of the founders, sufficiently irate. They can be a minority, but they need to be sufficiently irate. And the problem that we have in the monetary, so our civilization is, I guess, beset on all sides with, retrogressive forces that are trying to bring us back to the Dark Ages. On the monetary front, mostly it's perceived as inflation, and inflation is a statistic. So if you go back to Stalin, was another purely evil guy who had a shrewd observation is that if you kill one person, that's a horrible crime. If you kill 100 million people, it's a statistic. And so inflation is spoken of in statistical terms. M2 increased by 17% last quarter, and the CPI went up 7% last year, I think. It's just a statistic. It's antiseptic. It's a euphemism. It's very abstract. And then as you try to get into it, well, the Fed has to do this, the Fed has to do that. It becomes very intractable and very academic, and therefore kind of moot. And so everybody shrugs, what can you do about it? And then they complain that their boss hasn't given them a big enough raise, and so they're losing purchasing power, and life goes on. And what I aim to do is to show people that it's not a statistic, that there's an injustice here, and that the saviors are being looted, not principally because their saviors are losing purchasing power, but principally because the Fed it's called financial repression. The Fed has destroyed their ability to earn interest on their savings, which is a universal human need. So if you're 22 years old today, just graduated from university, entering the workforce, what advice do financial advisors give people? I can recall when I entered the workforce, standard advice back in those days was set 10% of your salary, set that aside, put that in like bank CDs. And by the time you turn 65, you will have whatever the number was in those days, I don't know, $1.something million saved up. But the magic was the compounding of the interest. After 45 years of doing this, I think it was 85% of what you would have, that $1.5 million by age 65, 85% of it wasn't the raw salary set aside, it was the compounding of the interest. Well, today the interest is zero. So if there's a reason why young people feel that the future is kind of hopeless, it's not that they can't buy more iPhones than ever. I mean, there weren't iPhones when I was 21. There weren't even, mobile phones was something you saw as a car phone. It was on Dallas. J.R. Ewing had one. Billionaires had them. We didn't have laptops. We have all these things, right? So consumer goods were way less then versus now. And foodie restaurants and avocado toast and all these things. But we had a future to look forward to because we could save and achieve our financial goals. And today, that's been taken away. And that is a horrific injustice. If people perceive this as an injustice, not as an antiseptic statistic, well, the CPI was 7%, well, whatever. But realize that they're taking away people's futures, that we're actually forced to consume our inheritance and our legacy. They forced us to be a prodigal, not a prodigal son, but a prodigal society, consuming the capital we inherited from better days. And people perceive that this is the perversity that is imposed on us by the fiat currency and the Federal Reserve. Then they'll be irate. And they're not just having an abstract discussion over an antiseptic statistic, they'll actually be pissed off. When enough people get pissed off enough, then there'll be a demand for change. In the meantime, I've lobbied a lot of legislatures. In Arizona, it was 5 years in a row, and we finally got a watered down, essentially repeal of the capital gains tax on gold. I've met legislators in other countries. I've met central bankers in a number of countries, including the U.S. There isn't any demand from the constituency, from the voters, for any kind of serious reform. And if there isn't any demand, even if in some cases, I know politicians that absolutely are keen to reform it, they don't find any constituent support for it. So it becomes at best a hobby project for them, and one that they realize that any effort they put into it, they're squandering their political capital on something that doesn't have any political payout. I don't think it's realistic to expect politicians to do that. And generally they don't.
So do you foresee the need for a coalition of communicators such as yourself and others, and coming on our show is maybe part of that, to educate people to the point where they do become irate and they do insist that their representatives undo the wrongs that have stolen their financial futures?
I would love to see that. And so the other thing that I founded around the time that I founded Monetary Metals is a 501c3 nonprofit called the Gold Standard Institute, for that education and that outreach, and which could serve as an umbrella for other irate communicators to to build a coalition and build a movement around this. I do think that is a component to the strategy.
Do you feel that Representative Ron Paul, during his stint in Congress, who seemed to be the standard bearer in most people's minds as far as a public figure who did take that on as a pet project year after year, decade after decade, do you feel that he was hitting the target, the real core of the message that you think needs to get out? Or was there something that needs to be said that people need to hear that he wasn't saying? And if so, how would you phrase that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of this is the financial repression, the destruction of the interest rate, and all the perversity that entails. So every time the interest rate is cut in half, there are some profound implications, one of which is that worker productivity has to double. You must produce twice as much with each halving of the interest rate, or else be made redundant and be laid off. So if people in the workforce today feel that there's this grindstone that just spins ever faster, they're right. There is. And it's not your boss being a jerk. It's the monetary system that's causing this. So I would make more of an interest rate focused argument than a consumer price index focused argument. The other thing that I think is really important, Ron Paul stood for a number of different issues, but I think it's really important that if someone is going to be the standard bearer and the poster child for the gold standard movement, that person be really focused on the gold standard to the exclusion of other issues. Because every issue you add to it, you divide the audience. I mean, not necessarily everybody agrees on all the other issues. So the more issues that you package deal, the more people say, I don't really want that package. So I think it should be somebody who's just a pure gold advocate, who's not political partisan in any other way, and doesn't really have any other issues that, they can have their own personal views, but don't really make it part of the movement and part of the message.
You mentioned before you don't necessarily subscribe to people who say, well, government in and of itself will just grow on its own and accumulate power to itself and so on. But you've got to acknowledge that over the past century, at least, maybe century and a half, you've been pointing out that the forces that are benefiting from Keynesian debauchement of the currency, et cetera, seem to be on the upswing as far as that they're holding the day, they're prevailing. That's the direction, the inexorable direction that things seem to be going. And anybody, maybe Ron Paul was one example of a voice on the other side, maybe you and I, our voices on the other side, seem to be struggling to even get a platform, that sort of thing. Do you see reason for hope that, or do you think there needs to be a change in approach to get a toehold against this? Or what do you perceive, if it's not just growing of its own accord, what do you think are the driving forces behind this inexorable increase in debauchement of the currency and the control over people's lives, et cetera, that we seem to be losing this battle to? To whom are we losing this battle?
It's a very broad question. Let me try to kind of reduce it by taking a look at the COVID situation as it developed, going back to March 2020. And one of the things I have to admit, I was just absolutely astonished, gobsmacked by how swiftly everybody in this country, but in the rest of the world, it was the same. In lockstep, demanded lockdowns. This unprecedented thing we've never experienced, at least during my lifetime. And very, very few kinds of anything remotely resembling a lockdown other than, during like bombing campaigns during a war. Obviously people have curfews and, the police will make you turn your lights off and things like that. But short of that, we've never really seen anything like that. And it happened so quickly. That was by popular demand. And so the real problem, and I hate to be the bearer of bad news, anybody thinking, oh, it's just an intrinsic tendency of government. The government officials want more power. Of course they want more power. I get that. But the people want to give them more power and demand that they take more power to solve every problem, both real and imagined. And as long as the population is trending towards wanting the government to have more power over our lives, then of course the government will be happy to oblige them and take that power. But I don't think government is the driver. I kind of see them, and most of the politicians, I'll use the analogy of cockroaches. And imagine you've had some giant party, there's a feast, and somehow by 3 a.m, the tables are thrown over, and what's left of the food and some beer is like now in the carpet. and the roaches have come out of the walls, and they're feasting on the spoils that are on the floor. The roaches weren't capable of even tipping the tables over, much less producing that feast. They're just cashing in. They're just taking advantage of what's being offered to them. And that's how I kind of see this. When the people are saying, government, please save us from this virus, take any measure up to and including declaring half of us non-essential and half of us essential, and sorting us out accordingly, which they did back in March, April of 2020. And the people are demanding these things. The people are saying, shut down, smash businesses because they grow too big and too successful under antitrust, throw people in jail for trading based on what they know, tax the rich, subsidize, what did Ronald Reagan say? If it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. If it stops moving, subsidize it. Tax every productive company and every individual in order to subsidize everything that isn't productive. As long as the people are demanding more and more and more of this, then we're going to have a government that gives us more and more and more of this, and they're going to give it to us good and hard. So the really hard problem is how do you deal with the intractable problem of trying to change the culture? And to my comment about a gold standard movement or an honest money movement, I think the easiest way to get so think about pressure and penetration. I'm a pretty big guy and I'm pretty strong. If I were to go push with both hands against drywall in my house, just standing there, I'm not going to be able to push through the drywall. But if I were to take one of those old compasses with a compass point made of steel, and with my two fingers, I could push it right through the drywall. And obviously that's a lot less force, but pressure is force divided by surface area. So if you have a specialty dedicated organization that focuses on one issue, you narrow the scope, you can get penetration. And I would love to see the flowering of 1,000, both nonprofits and for-profits, frankly. And I'm involved in a for-profit to bring about the gold standard. Each of which is making progress on a particular issue by a combination of exposing the injustices of how things currently are and painting a picture of a better place that we can get to if we restrict the government's power a little bit in a certain specific way that, our society will be better. And in movements that are succeeding, and marijuana is a good example, I think they've done that. They've shown the injustice of somebody rotting in prison for 20 years for smoking a joint. They're saying, is this really justice? Do you really feel better and sleep at night better knowing that you put this guy in prison for 20 years? And people are like, no, not really. That's the moment of victory. And then it sweeps through the state legislatures and, you get it. Now, the thing we have in marijuana today is not exactly liberty, but it's at least significantly less bad than, what we had before.
Yeah, one of the things I'll push back on a bit of what you said there about the analogy with the roaches in the party, and you can't blame it on the roaches for showing up. There is wisdom in what you're saying about rather than wringing our hands and feeling powerlessness. I know that Stephen Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, says once you swallow the bitter pill of responsibility, then you realize, look, if I brought this on myself through the choices I've made up to now, then I can get out of it. In other words, I hold the key to this jail cell I find myself in, not that, those so-and-sos put me in here. There is a insidious sort of a vicious cycle that happens, though, like, for example, with government schooling, when when that's not natural, it's not in the Constitution, etc., but we enable our young generations, generation after generation, to be indoctrinated, you might say, by the kind of thinking of at least understanding that subservience to government or obedience to government or dependence on government for things is part of the baking our children in the cake, so to speak, so that they think that that's normal. So now you look at the cultures, the subcultures where there's that strongest pull for more government involvement, socialistic policies and everything is coming from universities, from public educated students, etc. So that's where you mentioned earlier, hey, if this is by design, if it's by engineering, and that's where we had Alex Newman from The New American on talking about that our public schooling system was designed intentionally to increase power and concentrate power in the hands of the government by educating or miseducating generations of young people to think that that's what's normal and to forget about logic and so on. So I'll interject that yes, the key to freedom is taking personal responsibility, but let's not just heap more blame on the individual to say, you're the one who asked for it, so you deserve it. It's like we can choose different.
No, yeah. I don't mean it in the sense of blaming the individual per se. And by the way, I do think the difference between a politician and a roach, a politician's a human being. He has free will and agency. So he absolutely is to blame for, being the power luster and the kleptocrat. And he's not just a roach, cashing in. But to your comment about the public schools, Karl Marx put 10 planks of communism up. The two most important, again, from the communist perspective, is number 5, which is a central bank, which is the Federal Reserve, and number 10, which is government schools. Those two, if you really thought about it, probably those are the only two that are really necessary. You control the minds of the children and control the money. You control over everything you need. Everything else will fall into place for you. And then he has a bunch of other things in there, confiscating the properties of rebels and whatever. But absolutely, having government schools is indistinguishable and inseparable from having government propaganda indoctrinating into the minds of children. They are one and the same. And that movement for public schools around the turn of the previous century was a movement of, they called themselves the progressives at the time, but they were the socialists.
Yeah, that hasn't changed. So now, taking us forward to this other venture you have, which is for-profit, to try to help people get some justice and some fairness by being able to earn something on their savings going forward when that's not available in the banking system anymore. Thank you, Keynes. So how are you helping people to be able to earn on their true savings? And what do you consider true savings to be, and how do you consider that earnings possible?
Gold and silver being money, and having been money for thousands of years, tested by every market imaginable and every market condition imaginable, going back many thousands of years. And we pay interest on gold and we pay interest on silver in gold and silver. So no fiat currency involved in the transaction. So the benefit to the client is, instead of getting paid 0% on your dollars, you're getting 2% on gold. At the same time, even if you got 2% on your dollar, which is pretty hard to do, the Federal Reserve has as its stated mission 2% debasement per year, which is defined as stable purchasing power or stable value of the money. So George Orwell would either be grinning or spinning in his grave, depending on your perspective, looking at that, because that is Orwellian in itself. But anyways, even if you're getting paid 2%, if they're taking away 2% of the value of the currency, and I don't think it's that simple, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but if they're taking away 2% of the value of the currency in which you were earning 2%, are you really meaningfully moving ahead, or are you walking at 2 miles an hour on a up the escalator that's actually moving down at the same 2 miles per hour? Whereas in gold, obviously, the Fed can't print gold, and you don't have, that concept of inflation is simply not applicable. So by earning 2% in gold, you're getting 2% something real. At the same time, so that's the value proposition to the investor client, and I think a pretty simple one and a pretty compelling one. At the same time, this business was designed by my thinking about that last bit of Keynes's quote, by engaging the hidden forces of economics in favor of destruction. And I kept turning that over and over and over in my mind, saying, what if you engage those hidden forces, incentives, not in favor of destruction, but in favor of a return to normalcy, or return, to salvation? What would you do? Well, what you have to do if you want gold to circulate, right? So if there's no way to earn interest on gold, the gold all goes into hiding. And so think, even if you had a working gold coin standard, or people are passing gold coins around to buy consumer goods and pay wages and so forth, if there was no such thing as an interest rate, then the only way that workers could save would be they would pull the gold coins out of circulation and put them under their mattresses. So if there had been a circulating gold coin standard, it would seize up if the interest rate somehow ever went to zero, which it wouldn't. The gold standard has a stable interest rate, which is a whole other economic topic. So today, of course, there is no interest in gold. There used to be an interest in dollars. That's been destroyed. There's no interest in gold. So therefore, gold can't circulate. And the amount of gold that the world needs is essentially unlimited. It's a black hole. It can't really be filled. And that's why we keep pulling gold out of the ground, and it all disappears into the nooks and crannies of the market. People buy it up and hoard it. There's only one force that can pull gold out of hoards and into circulation. It's not, by the way, violence of the state. When FDR made gold illegal, I think he was, again, maybe shrewd enough or cunning enough not to go door to door with guns. And that would have precipitated something he probably didn't want. When Mao, the communist Chinese, they did go door to door with machine guns. You don't really get all that much gold because people just hide it deeper. They have it buried 1 foot under the floorboards, but then once they realize the government's going door to door with guns, then they bury it, 6 feet under. 1933, the term came about, midnight gardening. People were burying their gold. So the only way to pull the gold out of private hiding and to circulate in the market is interest. And the way to do that, so one, the incentive to people to bring their gold and participate, they need an incentive, they need a profit to do so. And then what are you doing? Well, you're financing something productive. And so it's that productive enterprise needs finance. Every bit of food you eat, every computer you use, every internet you connect to with all the gear in between and the service providers, all has to be financed, which means somebody's borrowing money in order to build all these things and provide all these things. Today they're borrowing dollars, but the system is, in late stages of implosion or self-destruction. So our vision is to bring gold back into use as a vehicle for finance, and make incentives to the borrowers to why they want to borrow in gold, and make incentives to the gold owners to why they want to lend in gold, which is interest. And in so doing, recreate the conditions that recreate the circulation of gold in the economy as not only a medium of exchange, but at least first and more importantly, as a medium of finance. And if we can do that, then we give the entire society a graceful, at the end of the day, when the dollar fails, which it will, gold will be the only thing left standing. The question is, do we do so in a catastrophic failure like 476 AD, or do we do it in a more graceful transition without the kind of abrupt discontinuities and dislocations of a collapse? And that's what Monetary Metals is working on. And, the business is growing at an exponential rate because people get it. Like, you don't have to explain if you have gold and you're currently paying for storage, and we say, okay, no, now you no longer pay for storage, now you get interest. It's not something that requires a great economic explanation and a lot of hand waving, a lot of doom and gloom charts. It's like, we'll pay you. And then once they understand, okay, how are you able to pay us? Well, we're leasing it out to this party over here. Then it's a simple proposition that offers the antidote to Keynes by engaging all the hidden forces of economics in favor of destruction. We're engaging hidden forces of economics, but in favor of the opposite.
There's even some scriptural quotes about the wise steward who invested properly and had gains versus the one who just buried it in the ground and had nothing to show for it. What about people's concerns? There's a saying you're no doubt familiar with about if you don't hold it, you don't own it. Also, people are seeing the structural strains that are building in our existing banking system, fiat currency system, credit system, the repo crisis, all this stuff. And they're saying it's almost like near the end of a game of musical chairs where the music's about to stop and everyone will be scrambling for having a physical chair. So people may be loath to direct control and introduce any counterparty risk in the access to their metals. What do you do when you talk with people who feel that way, who say, I'm not comfortable in this environment, while there's a potential storm cloud coming on the horizon that could disrupt a lot of business affairs, to put my metal out there and on lease for the hope of 2% annual gain or whatever, if I'm afraid I might lose the whole thing? You've got to address that concern with people. How do you address it?
Yeah, it's a very simple answer, which is, okay, what percentage of your portfolio do you have in physical gold? And if the answer is 100%, okay, I get that, I respect that. you're probably not our client. Most people say, well, 5% or whatever. What are you doing for the other 95%? That's okay. So you have your gold, call it stash, against the doom and gloom and all these horrific things that can come. Leave that where it is, under the floorboards, in the mattress, or whatever. What about the other 90%, 95%? Is that in various meme stonks and treasury paper and all kinds of other stuff that your conventional financial advisor has put you in? We can compete against that side of things. Yes, if everybody should have a certain amount of physical gold and silver, sort of in your hand, as it were, but probably not 100%. If you have any kind of significant means or significant wealth in life, you really want, first of all, it's inconvenient and you need liquidity and other things, but you're taking an extreme risk to have that, and you can't insure it. There's home invasion, flood, fire, etc. Anyway, most of our clients have portfolios of conventional investments. It's that side that we're targeting that's what we disrupt. Maybe a little bit less in the way of treasury bond, and increase the allocation to gold. But this part of your gold isn't your stash. This part of your gold is an actual investment that does something that all your other paper investments don't do.
And I know you said it in passing, but I want to make it just explicit so I understand it and so our viewers do as well, is that people who would take part of their additional investments that might be currently out into stocks, bonds, mutual funds, CDs, whatever, and say, yeah, I'll take a portion of that, I'll put it into physical gold, but then I'll lease it through this program and I'll get paid back in gold, if I understand correctly, at a rate of a couple percent a year. So earning gold on my gold going forward, and considering that a more prudent investment than staying in the so-called casino of all these other assets that are on the bubble of everything right now. Any particular thoughts for them in that regards? I think one of the things you pointed out is if you're earning fiat interest on any other savings, you can't count it the same way because the loss of purchasing power means you're walking up and down going elevator or escalator. But in this case, if you're earning physical gold on your physical gold, then any debasement of the currency is not working against you as it would be in any other nominal gains. Is that correct? Right.
And then I was going to say, in addition to that, you have two other issues with your conventional investments. One is you could be looking at a 50 to 75% capital loss if there's another 2008 type event. And certainly in stocks and real estate, I don't think that's a risk to treasury bonds. I'm bullish on treasury bonds for all the perverse reasons that I'm talking about with the falling interest rate. But if you own stocks, let alone stonks, these meme stocks like GameStop and AMC and whatever that are, actually more broadly is the concept of zombie. Now, zombie is not a term, economic zombie is not a term coined by the lunatic fringe and the conspiracy theorists. It's a term from the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. And a zombie is a company whose profits are less than their interest expense. That is, they can't even service their debt on their meager profits without having to borrow more just to simply pay the interest. So imagine you have a salary of whatever, $50,000, and the interest on your credit card bill is greater than your $50,000 salary. That's kind of the position they're in. A striking proportion, I think it's something like 20% of all the major corporate debt that's out there is zombie debt. And so if you own the equity, now think about equity and debt as two different tiers of the capital structure of a corporation. If the corporation can't really pay its debt, the equity is what's left over after the debt is repaid. So you could be looking at 100% loss in the equity. And how do you compare that to, the risk the gold price could drop 10%? What is it? One of the big banks just said they think the gold price is going to be $1,500. So what is that? It's not quite 30%, 25% or whatever down it is now. Okay, there's some risk of that, right? I could say I'm bullish. I can say all the reasons why I think the price of gold isn't likely to go to $1,500 or whatever. Neither here nor there. The gold market doesn't care about my opinion unless it goes to $1,500. Well, what happens if you own the stock in a zombie and it goes to zero because the zombie is found to be insolvent? Or rather, everyone knows it's insolvent. it's plain black and white on its financial statements, but the market suddenly prices it as an insolvent entity rather than as a meme stock or whatever. How do you reckon with that risk? And, what does that mean? And these are some of the reasons why people own physical gold. And so I think that it's that counterparty risk thing that's the big driver to gold. Now, in the case of a lease, what makes a lease, at least in our program, everybody uses that term differently. And the banks mean something quite different when they say lease than what we mean when we say it. What makes a lease, at least for us, is that you own the title to the gold. We don't own it, and the lessee who's using it doesn't own it. Which means if they declare bankruptcy, we just repossess the gold. It's not an asset that becomes available to their creditors, and the investor, the gold investors, just take a number in line. We get the gold back. We're the first in line, and so we're not really. It's not. You can never say there's no risk. Any person selling you any kind of investment who says there's no risk is just full of what and should not be listened to. There is a risk, but the risks in this business are quite different from the risks in the conventional business. And since these are gold businesses, if anybody is likely to survive the kind of calamity of a collapse of fiat and collapse of the monetary system, these would be the businesses likely to do it. These are the bullion dealers and the refiners and the mints, gold mining companies. These are companies that are dealing in gold that suddenly will find quite a lot of demand for their product and quite a lot of creative customers that will find ways to pay for it, whatever it is they've got to do. The demand for gold will not be drying up, especially not in that environment. In fact, it'll be the other way around. The demand for dollars on the part of gold owners may be drying up. Yes, that's a risk that's out there, but unless you want to own 100% of your portfolio in gold, physical, and stand there with your AK-47 and guard it, if you're going to have investments and you're going to trust any kind of investment to any counterparty, then we think you should have some of that in gold leasing program and getting some return on it. And there's a social purpose to this as well, which is to begin the process of gold to circulate once again, as it had certainly up until 1933, to begin that process. So this is a business that's designed to accomplish a social good by making money for our clients and making money for ourselves. I intend to make money on this by making money for my clients and changing the world in a way that brings us to a better place.
We've been speaking with Keith Weiner. He's the founder and CEO of Monetary Metals. We'll put a link to that in the description of this video. It's intriguing, and Keith, there's so much more that you have to say about our financial lives, about our freedom, about the role of government and the role of sovereign people. We'd like to have you back on again as soon as we can here, and thank you for joining us this first time on Liberty and Finance.
Look forward to that, and thank you.
This is Dunnigan Kaiser, founder of Liberty and Finance. I'm now a licensed gold and silver broker for Miles Franklin. Call me directly for the physical gold and silver that you need at the best price with personalized private service from one of the oldest and best companies in the business. 31 years strong, A+ rated by the Better Business Bureau, 0 complaints, licensed and bonded. For physical delivery, vault storage, or precious metals IRAs, excellent prices, privacy, and confidentiality. Pay by check, money order, ACH, bank wire, or Bitcoin. Satisfaction guaranteed. For fastest service, just call 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 888-81-LIBERTY. And either I or one of my sons and fellow brokers will call you back as soon as we can and understand your needs.